So far, I've been looking at your stuff sporadically and randomly through the fog, and I'm slowly beginning to piece it together. First of all, the Bloke Fest flyer is your inaugural production, and you've made a very good fist of what is probably the most difficult job of the lot. It's clean, attractive, and above all, legible. If that's your first effort, in a couple of years' time, your output will be awesome. Handed out at one of our gigs following Chris's explanation and the audience having had a chance to weigh us up, the nature of Blokefest is probably clear enough. Landing on your table in the pub with no explanation, the flyer has a much tougher job on its hands. It needs to sketch out the weekend's menu, the food, the pub, the expert tutors, the variety concert, etc. All of this against a headwind already blowing chill through men's frail anxiety centres, whipped up by the very term Blokefest and set spinning by Brokeback Mountain connotations of tents and camp, compounded by earlier versions of the Blokefest website which featured cowboys, now happily abandoned. At the same time, the flyer needs to persuade men that they are eligible, comfortably equal to the task, and will enjoy themselves. That no previous singing ability is required, that songs are taught at a level all can understand and follow, that singing in a group is an extraordinary experience which should be on everyone's bucket list, that you'll meet friends, get the names of plumbers and folk with Hondas to sell from far and wide. In other words, it's an impossible task to fit into one flyer. Also, despite my didactic dictum about words, a fair few of them are necessary here, as you've rightly decided. I've had doubts about Neil's choice of the font Londrina from the outset. Its equivocal position between a hand-drawn and a regular type font worried me aesthetically, but mainly it's the addition of random pepperings of full stops through the text, which makes my false teeth hurt, and which doesn't seem to enhance or convey anything except perhaps carelessness. I also have a peculiar aversion to M's and W's, whose centres fall short of the length of the two strokes on either side. Irrational, I know, but in fairness, these things probably ought to be out in the open. Before we leave typography, men's singing festivals should have the apostrophe before the S. Proofreading should be designated a reserved occupation, and practitioners should be given free beer for life. Executed, of course, when they miss one, but they are invaluable, indispensable, and despicable. Access to a good library of images is essential, and I'll return to that later. It looks like you had to work with an image which was simultaneously too cropped and not cropped enough. First, the uncropped, which are the blokes spread out, sprawled in some cases, focusing on a leader with his back to the camera. The atmosphere is studious, possibly slightly soporific, even a tad tedious. A snap of chaps evidently enjoying themselves is essential. Maybe looking through a clump of men singing to the tutor in front, in full encouraging flow. Smaller clumps of men with readable expressions, not strung out with gaps, and keeping shorts and knees to a minimum for multiple reasons that I don't need to elucidate. Fewer is more. There are too many shorts and too much sprawling on the website, by the way. The bit that's too cropped is the marquee. There's not enough of it at the top. The perspective of the stripes plays optical tricks, a bit like the hollow face illusion which I mentioned in the typography session. The stripes appear to move away from the viewer, creating the illusion that the men are standing in front of an awning rather than inside a tent. It takes a little while for the brain to sort it out. A view of the tent rising to the top with the main text overlaid would help create the sense of being inside bathed in the warm yellow light of the coloured canvas. Alternatively, the image needs to be at the top of the page, but we can only work with what we're given. I think I was asked to submit a Blokefest flyer once, but not for the first time in my life. I was quietly rejected by the committee. If I were given this impossible task, I'd happily go with a marquee image, but I would also include some lighter element in the foreground. A close-up of Putnam's frying pan in action, with him or another sitting behind and to the left, forming an L shape to leave room for the text to the right on the green, as you've already done. Springs to mind. The only Blokefest snaps I could find readily are monochrome. But this year you can take your phone around looking for images that can go on next year's flyer. Something fun, unintimidating and domestic that can add to an impression of the variety of activity and laughs to be had. I'd also bung in something like this note swapping between Phil and Bob to counterbalance any akimbo pale blue shorts and naked knees on folding chairs, or worse, sprawled on the grass, that might creep in. Remember, the flyer is beckoning to strangers. Incidentally, the best resolution image from your phone is usually adequate for A4 posters and even A3 at a push. Just make sure they're imported into a page which you've set up to 300 pixels per inch. Images. You need them. You're working with one arm behind your back. Images of locations and venues you can usually purloin from the web, but you desperately need some decent snaps of the Feast of Fools. You don't need a professional, but you do need someone who can reliably frame the group sensibly, certainly without cropping personnel or their parts inadvertently. Also, they need to be sensitive to the amount of light falling on the fools' faces. Backlighting can be atmospheric, but it's generally useless from a graphic point of view. Finding the angle for folk to face so they're well lit but not squinting is not rocket science. In strong light, removing hats which cast obliterative shadows over faces. Tilting heads so shadows from the nose are minimized. These are not difficult things to remember and look out for if the photographer is just mindful of their primary duty to produce a working image, not an award-winning frameable picture. Another advantage of the individual approach is that the eventual group can all have serious expressions or cheerful ones. A mixture can be unsettling, which is why photographers require subjects to say things like curly-whirly. I don't, as I'm boycotting Cadbury's still, due to Kraft's duplicity. It is only the men who are important. All location shots have limited utility. Looking out dreamily from a cliff top with oodles of blue sky behind, providing the photographer hasn't fallen to their death, may be useful in several flyers, whereas men sitting on a wall with the river and Cotswoldy stone buildings background will have a narrower application. Ideally, you want men separated from context altogether, much like we do for the AKs, so you can easily put them in any context, from outer space to a coal mine. Plain, unfussy backgrounds are best, and snaps of individual men are more useful than groups of the buggers. I'd make sure there was at least one set of men looking serious and another of them looking amiable, even if necessary, laughing. It's almost impossible to take a snap of someone in the act of singing that doesn't look gross. But you might try a range of expressive possibilities which you think may be relevant. I don't suggest group snaps are useless. It's just that if you overlap, you're set in aspic. If Darren stands behind you or has his arm behind your head and his hand on your shoulder, he can never be in front unless you put him close enough to the edge to crop his missing limb. And then there's the disembodied hand on your shoulder to resolve. Anyway, you're probably ahead of me. Just one more tip for the novice photographer. If you're taking individual snaps on a bright, cloudy day, try to get the snaps done in batches. That is, all the serious ones first, then the cheerful ones, etc. And all the while keeping an eye on the clouds approaching the sun. Obviously, this is to avoid having a well-lit trio with a fourth ill-lit, gloomy bugger tacked on the end. I see some potential in the behind the bars image. I blackened out the interior background and lightened faces, particularly Phil's, but it's still not a readily adaptable image. If I were having to produce the flyer with just these resources, I think I'd fill most of the frame with the Abbey exterior image, perhaps reducing its opacity and extending the sky to the top. The trouble is, not being familiar with elements, I have to explore how to do stuff, take screenshots, and try and remember how I did it. I'm not good at making notes as well as screenshots, too many tasks at once. So I'll try and remember at this distance. Please expect there to be omissions. First, I opened an A4 portrait template and imported the Abbey image. I sized it to the dimensions I wanted and set it at the bottom of the page. I then selected the clone tool, set it to a suitable size brush, and pressing Alt as I clicked the mouse to select the sky in the middle of an expansive patch of blue. The reason for this is that as you go painting with the clone tool, its travel is matched by the original source point, and if you go too far in your painting, the source point may have strayed beyond the sky and be reproducing bits of the Abbey. To remedy this, simply reset the source to its original beginning and carry on painting and resetting till the job's done. Using the mouse, I painted over the dark branches to the right. This is because I didn't want the ghost in the machine that's going to give me a new sky to think that the branches needed to be retained. Inevitably, with my colouring in, I went over the lines. I cleaned this up by drawing a marquee rectangle slightly overlapping the main edge of the sky and covering my mistakes, and pressed the backspace. I haven't checked yet, but I think I could have got rid of the branches much quicker and easier by drawing a marquee round them and going up to Edit, Fill Selection, and enter Content Aware in the Use box. Just tried this and it's not as efficient as Photoshop, so maybe just as fiddly. Useful thing to know though. Double-click on the foreground colour square at the bottom of the Tools menu to the left of your workspace, and using the eyedropper, select the darkest blue of your sky. Your foreground square should now be blue. Now draw another marquee over the white space above the Abbey image and make it slightly overlap into the sky. And go to Edit, Fill Selection, and put Foreground Colour in the Use box. Next is the fun part. Deselect the marquee and click on Guided, which is the central option of the three at the top of your workspace. Click on Special Effects and Perfect Landscape, just below the top three options. The Landscape option brings up a menu, number 3 of which gives you the chance to magically create a new sky. Options range from various noon skies through to sunset and moonlight. I choose Blue 1 as I'm really just creating a background sky extension that's in keeping. Next, I imported the behind bars image, which I fiddled with, as described above, and simulated text, rotation, and drop shadows, dark and light, to taste. If I had a snap of the four of you looking down, I'd use an interior shot looking up at the wonderful vaulting. I could always use the perspective tool, which we used for the God's shadow in the first session, to enhance the impression of the photographer floor level looking up at you. I wouldn't add halos, though I'd be sorely tempted. The aerial shot of Beckford's Tower reminded me of the happy occasion when I discovered a similar shot of St. Peter's. I set to and found a balloon and basket in which I crammed the men. The ground below was in quite sharp focus, so I used the motion blur tool up at the very top, filter to blur to motion blur, to help make the basket stand out and add a sense of drifting. The captions announce themselves. Bath is invariably full of balloons on a balmy evening, so it would have an authentic ring. It may need a sky extension, as I applied to the Abbey snap. Anyway, I hope this feedback has been helpful, Peter. I'm sorry it comes creeping slow these days. Let me know if you still have questions. I think you're doing brilliantly.